Pole Position is a game that I first played when I got Namco Museum 64 for Christmas one year. Back then, I was terrible at it. My 9-year-old self couldn't get the hang of the controls back then, so my runs ended pretty quickly. However, over the last couple of years, I've been revisiting the original game as well as playing Pole Position 2, this time on the GameCube version of Namco Museum. First, I beat the original Pole Position's only course, and then I worked my way through Pole Position 2. First I beat Suzuka, then the test course, then Fuji, and then recently, I beat Seaside to finish it for good. After finishing both the games, it's pretty clear that they are the prototypes for the arcade racers that came after. Whether it be Sega's classic racers like Hang On and Outrun, or even Namco's later offerings like the Final Lap series, Suzuka 8 Hours, and the Ridge Racer series. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how each of these games had a big influence on the arcade racing game genre. I think it's best to start this discussion by talking about the original Pole Position from 1982. This game had to be pretty mind-blowing for the early 80s, which was the golden age of arcade games. This is one of the earliest racing games to have the classic behind-the-car view instead of a top-down perspective that many racing games featured by default prior, like Namco's Rally X for example. Now there were some exceptions to this back in the day, like Night Drive and its first-person view. However, Night Drive did not look nearly as good as this game. In all fairness though, Night Drive did come out several years prior. It's also more impressive than Sega's Turbo from 1981, which attempted a pseudo 3D perspective, but it was more like a weird angled top-down perspective. On the other hand, the game engine for Pole Position was just incredible for 1982, providing top-notch 2D graphics that were able to pull off the pseudo 3D look while delivering a smooth frame rate and a simple but colorful racetrack based on the real-life Fuji Speedway. As far as the gameplay goes, the biggest thing that Pole Position did was establish a real scoring system inside of a racing game with multiple components. Scoring was based on how well you did in qualifying, how many cars you passed during the race, and how much time you had remaining at the end of the race. This gave players extra incentive to drive well beyond just getting to the finish line. Another thing that doesn't get talked about much with this game is that it is one of the earliest arcade games that had a clear start and finish to it, without loops. This is one of the only arcade games of its time that could be truly finished on one credit, if you were a skilled player, without the game continuing to loop over and over again. Even the earliest auto-scrolling arcade shmups like Scramblin' Vanguard for example still had loops. Now I can't say every aspect of this game is innovative. The gear system was done in several games prior, even as far back as 1974, Grand Track 10 from Atari had one. That being said, the high gear and Pole Position gave players a fantastic sense of speed for the time. The biggest problem nowadays with the original Pole Position is just the lack of content. This game only had one course. Once the player learned that course, they were essentially done unless they decided to play for score. When I came back to it a couple of years ago, it only took me an hour or two to finish the race for the first time. For the time though, that wasn't such a big deal, especially in an arcade environment where owners wanted to get players off the cabinet quickly or force them to keep spending money. However, no racing game today could get away with the lack of courses and only one car. That's just the truth about today's racing games. But these games still owe a little something to this one at the end of the day. Pole Position 2 came out just a year after the original game, and on the surface, it seems like a glorified expansion pack for the original game. After all, it did run on the same board, making it easy for arcade owners at the time to upgrade. However, the thing that gets lost sometimes is that this sequel did try to expand the gameplay. The first thing when you start playing is that now you have 4 courses to choose from instead of just one, fixing the biggest complaint I had with the original game. Not only that, but these courses varied by difficulty. The test course is the easiest course where you shouldn't have to slow down much. Fuji, also known as Namco Circuit in Namco Museum re-releases of the game, is the same course as in the original game, but it is a tad bit more challenging here. The two hardest courses are Seaside and Suzuka. Seaside, in my opinion, is the easier of the two hard courses, but your opinion may vary on this. I feel like it's at least a bit easier to survive the toughest corners. Based on personal experience, Suzuka, known as Wonder in re-releases, has a couple of nasty sections that can make mincemeat of newcomers. Now the thing is, having these 4 courses of different difficulties helped to establish a trope that would continue in arcade racing games far beyond this one. Super Hang-On did the same thing with its courses. Daytona USA, the Cruisin' series, and the original San Francisco Rush, for example, did this in arcades in the 90s. The only real difference between these games and Pole Position 2 in this regard is the fact that Pole Position 2 did not label the courses at the select screen. You just had to go by the track layouts that are given to you for each course, and then play each of them to get your own opinion. The changes to Pole Position 2 were actually deeper than just some extra tracks. The gameplay was tweaked as well in a few different ways. 1. The car here is much faster than it was in the original. It is also blue instead of red and has a different engine sound. 2. You take a bit longer to recover from crashes, punishing the player more for driving poorly. Plus, there are some hidden mechanics that can increase your speed. One such technique is to hold the accelerator down well before the lights turn green. If you do this, you'll get more squealing as well as pick up a bit more top speed later on than if you started accelerating only when the light turned green. I picked up on this from watching other players. In fact, that trick made a difference for me on Suzuka when I was trying to complete that course a while back. However, the biggest trick to this one is the speed glitch. I'm still not entirely sure how to trigger it despite doing quite a bit of testing, but I have seen it for myself and it is in both the original arcade release and later re-releases. What seems to happen is, the faster you go and the cleaner you drive overall, the more likely you are to start getting a huge speed increase. I used to think I was triggering it by shifting down and back up very quickly at higher speeds, but I don't think that's the case at this point. I've seen people mention that hitting an oil slick or puddle at the right speed can trigger this, but I've also seen this boost happen without doing that. This is easiest to pull off on the test course, where you don't have difficult turns. I've even seen world record holder Daniel Yamnitz exploit this even on a difficult course like Suzuka, which is where I first noticed this trick. I'll have a link to his recent world record run of that course in the description below. He takes advantage of this trick big time. His speeds get crazy. Another major change to the gameplay is the increase in traffic and how they behave. In the first game, the other cars were kinda chill. They didn't make too many lane changes and were not much of a threat. In the second game, however, they are certainly a bit more erratic, especially when combined with the RNG that affects where the cars pop up on the course. You'll see some cars even veer towards you as you're trying to pass them sometimes. Sometimes, 2 cars will even take up each lane and you'll have to go in between them. If you end up wheel to wheel with one of them, you'll get repelled away a little bit and lose some speed. Kind of like 2 magnets pushing each other away. Erratic traffic became a trope in games like Cruisin' USA later on, for better or for worse. Yet another gameplay change is that the oil slicks are now something to avoid. In the first game, they did nothing. In this game, however, they'll slow you down a lot, so don't run over them. The last positive about Pole Position 2 would be the graphical improvements made. One small improvement is the debris that comes from the crashes. However, there is another one that you may not notice right away, and it is the roads. Not only do you have the lines in the center of the road for most courses, you also have some subtle horizontal lines that give off even more of an illusion of speed than there already was. This is something that other games like Outrun would do later on. Yet another way that Pole Position 2 would influence future racing games. Now there is one flaw that sets both the original game and its sequel back, and that would be the driving physics. For its time, the physics weren't questioned too much because these games were well ahead of the pack in a lot of ways. Keep in mind that these games predated the start of Yu Suzuki's excellent run of superscalar racing games, like Hang On and Outrun. In retrospect, however, the handling is simply too tight and quite slippery. Normally, you want the controls to be tight, especially in 2D games. The problem with super tight controls in a game like this, a racing game, is that it makes it very difficult for players to make smaller adjustments to their racing line, for instance, as they're driving at faster speeds. This also makes it more of a pain to weave through traffic than it should be. It just makes the cars feel slippery, and this is especially bad when you're trying to make big turns. Later racing games like the ones made by Sega had slightly looser handling. Not too loose, but enough to make the cars not feel slippery. Even Namco later on would drop the pole position physics in games like the Final Lap series and Ridge Racer. I would imagine a lot of this just had to do with the limitations of the hardware at the time. Shinichiro Okamoto, one of the creators of pole position, said in an interview many years ago that getting the controls right was quite difficult. That being said, if you like the way these games play despite that, you won't find many other games like them. There is real depth to the second one in particular, and there's a lot of room for players to improve their score. Plus, these are some of the only racing games that have a strong emphasis on scoring. Later racing games made this an afterthought for the most part, with the exception of Outrun 2 and its revisions. If you want scoring in your racing games, this is definitely one to play, even if there's a bit of a learning curve to the driving. But what do you think of the two pole position games? Did you play these games in arcades back in the day? Did you play them on Namco Museum collections like I did? Or did you play them on some other re-release such as Microsoft Return of Arcade or the recent Arcade Archives releases? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Also, I'll have links to playthroughs I've done of these games in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.